Okay.
We're
ready.
got it.
Ready.
Ron.
To brag.
Ma'am.
May I say something? I've been hardly waiting to hear your lectures, and I literally bought hearing aids to hear you. I'm not kidding, I did, because I don't hear you, and you have a very soft voice, and you get right to your most exciting point, and you drop your voice. Will you take a friendly admonition?
Yes, ma'am. I will be nice and loud, and everybody up front will go. Rick, are we ready?
We're playing.
We are good.
We have been playing.
All right. This is lecture 1 of a new, somewhat experimental Bible study approach. The title of this series of lectures is going to be St. Mark's Gospel in St. Mark's World. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means this. Most of us, I think, when we were in high school or college or even earlier, or at church, were given the impression that you got the Old Testament, and then on top of that, you got the New Testament. And that's pretty much it. But that is very misleading, because what you really have, you've got the Old Testament, and you've got the wisdom of the classical world, the culture that existed that wasn't Jewish. Remember, the church expanded into the non-Jewish culture very, very quickly. And those cultures were in touch with one another. They were not at all isolated from one another. You've got the Jewish culture, you've got that Greco-Roman, Roman imperial, but mostly Greek cultural culture. And then on top of that, the church comes. It's not as simple. And if we want to understand and derive as much knowledge and guidance and, frankly, just pleasure from the study of Scripture as we can, then it helps to have a good deal of cultural background to help understand what the gospel or whatever book we're reading would have sounded like and meant to its original hearers. That's important. Now I want to start by passing something around. There's a reason here, okay? I always have a reason for my madness. There you go. Please pass that around. I want everybody to touch it, and then when I get it back, I'll comment on it. So, what's the style going to be here? I want to start tonight. Oh, and by the way, there is caffeine. So those of you who've heard me preach and know you'll need it, it's over there. What I'm going to do tonight is really not get into the gospel too much at all. What I want to do is go through what's going to sound terribly boring, but I hope it's helpful. It's a sort of a timeline of what I've called significant cultural events. These are things that that had happened in the past, and a couple of which would happen early in St. Mark's lifetime, that would have affected the world in which he lived. So, any starting point is arbitrary here. So you'll be relieved to know I'm not starting with Adam and Eve, but I am starting way early. In fact, way early, 960 BC. What happened that year? What happened that year was the completion of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Remember this when we get into the gospel, that the original temple that was built in Jerusalem was built 1,000 years before Mark lived. It had 1,000 years of temple worship, interrupted, of course, by the Babylonian captivity, but there were 1,000 years of temple history behind Judaism. And when Jesus went to the temple, or when any Jew went to the temple, they were going to something that was in a spot that had been holy to them for 1,000 years. And that was really at the center of many Jews' worship. So we'll skip ahead 200 years. That'll help, okay? Let's get some time out of the way. 776 BC, first recorded ancient Olympic Games. The Olympic Games were not just a contest. The Olympic Games had an enormous cultural significance to all of the Greek-speaking peoples of the ancient East. Remember, Greece was never a country until, the 19th century. Greece was not a country. To be Greek didn't mean, yes, I'm a citizen of Greece. There was no such thing. It meant that you were culturally Greek, that you spoke Greek. And if you were Greek, and only if you were Greek, you could participate in the Olympic Games. It was one of the things that held the Greeks together as a people, the Olympic Games and a common language. Also a common religion. 753 BC, that's a traditional date, but it seems to be close to the founding of Rome. So by this point, we've now got the major players in place, the major cultural players, the Jews, the Greeks, and the Romans. In 586 or 597, some people have some questions about it, Solomon's temple was destroyed. Without going too much into detail about what was going on, the great powers of the East, the great Mesopotamian powers, were constantly seeking to expand their power south, just as Egypt was constantly seeking to expand its power north. And the Jews finally got into a situation where they simply could not get out of it politically or militarily. They were defeated, and Solomon's temple was destroyed.
What was the year?
Now, kind of at 586. Now, this was a huge blow.
The Babylonians.
After all, up to this point, being Jewish had been defined largely by worship in the temple. One of the things that held Judaism together was that the temple was the only place that blood sacrifice could be offered. There were certain rituals that had to be observed, certain things that were part of what they believed God had commanded them to do that could only be done in the temple. Now the temple's gone. Is Judaism going to survive? It was probably an intention of their captors that they not survive. Why do I say that? Because what they did was carry off to Babylon not every Jewish person. There were still Jewish people left in Israel. But to carry off all of the leadership, all of the nobility, all of the craftsmen, all of the people other than basic agricultural laborers. That's really who was left. So now, what's going to happen as a result of that? This, by the way, was not something that they had just invented, that the Babylonians just invented. The Babylonians did this regularly. When they captured areas and they conquered areas, they would deport their leadership, sometimes to Babylon itself, sometimes to somewhere else, assuming that without the leadership, the peasantry would find it harder to revolt. Generally speaking, it worked. And what generally happened was both groups, the leadership and the people who were left behind, gradually became Babylonian culturally. That didn't happen with the Jews. It didn't happen because what arose in Babylon with the great prophets like Isaiah was an understanding that being Jewish was not necessarily all about temple worship. That there was more to it than that. It was not just ritual. That there was something inside you. There was something more than that. And this began a whole development of a line of thought that was going to lead to the Pharisees in Jesus' time. The idea that what really made you Jewish was keeping the law and studying what God had said to his people and what God had done with his people. Well, there'll be more of that later, more about that later. 563 BC, the Buddha is born. His influence on the ancient Mediterranean, virtually nil, but I thought you might want to know. Same with Confucius. He was born in 551. So the 6th century BC was obviously a very good time for religious leadership to be born. In 550, the Babylonian Empire had fallen, and it was replaced by the Persian Empire, which is going to loom very, very large in the history of the Greeks. The Persian Empire, Achaemenid Empire, this was the great founder was Cyrus the Great. Why was he great? He was great for a lot of reasons. For one reason, he let the Jewish leadership go back to Jerusalem, and the temple was rebuilt, although in a much poorer way. Shoot, I had something to say there. Anyhow, Cyrus was highly admired by most of the peoples who knew anything about him. And it's a very interesting commentary that in Orthodox Judaism, there are only certain names that you may give your sons. They have to be Bible names. But you can name them Cyrus. That's how highly Cyrus is regarded. So Cyrus founds the Achaemenid Empire, also known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. By destroying the Babylonian Empire, and that happens in 539. He reigns for another 10 years. After his death, the Persian Empire is still expanding, and Cambyses II conquers ancient Egypt. This is the guy you were watching a documentary on the other evening. Conquers ancient Egypt. His son, Darius I, Darius the Great, subjugates Thrace, that's roughly the Balkans, Macedonia, and Libya. This is the largest extent of the Persian Empire. It's now stretching all the way from Turkey down south of Egypt and then across to the Balkans. That's a pretty sizable amount of territory. This is the Darius who will come into conflict with the Greeks. 509, what's happening in Rome? Because you're going to matter. 509 is the traditional date for the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, and the foundation of the Roman Republic, with its two consuls as for the executive function. 522, Darius becomes the king of Persia. Now in 499, we're now getting into an area where we can start talking about much more real history, because where we're into now, we're into Herodotus country, and I'm a big fan of Herodotus, so yeah. By the way, is that piece of metal still circulating? Oh.
I don't know where it is. There it is.
Oh, what's that?
Sorry.
We haven't seen it over here.
I'm going to need that. In 499 BC, one of the Greek-speaking cities in Turkey, which was within the Persian Empire, King Aristagorus of Miletus, starts a rebellion against the Persians. So this is Persia had conquered many of these individual Greek cities, and they were Greek cities. They were Greek-speaking. They were culturally Greek, but they were in what we know as Turkey. And that began a long cycle of violence between the Greeks and the Persians. The initial cycle was this. The uprising was initially successful. The Athenians decided they were going to help out the rebels. Well, the rebels lost. And consequently, King Xerxes I decides that he is going to take his revenge on the Greeks in general and the Athenians in particular. This is very significant. Xerxes is, we have what Herodotus tells us, and some of it is very iffy, particularly about numbers. But certainly we know a good bit about what happened. So what was significant about what happened with that invasion? Well, the first thing is this. As the army came across and began marching down the eastern coast of Greece, they were supported by a large fleet, because that's how you had to carry. If you had to carry a lot of stuff a long way, and believe me, it's an army and it's got to eat, and there are a lot of them. So the Greeks sent a force to Thermopylae. I'm sure most of you probably know about the Battle of Thermopylae, where a Spartan force was overwhelmed after a very, very spirited and very, very courageous and very bloody resistance. What you may not realize is that the Spartans weren't the only ones there. They were the leadership, but there were other contingents there. And one contingent, the men of Thespis, stayed with them until the end. I won't go into all the tactical stuff, but I want to talk about the importance of Thermopylae. Thermopylae was not just a win, or well, it was loss, actually. It was a tactical and strategic loss, but it was a propaganda win. And the spirit of Thermopylae is what really inspired many of the Greek city-states to attempt to resist the Persian invaders. It's very difficult to believe that Athens alone could have done it. In fact, Athens didn't do it. If you think of Athens as the city, the Athenians abandoned their city, and it was destroyed. It was occupied and destroyed by the Persians. If you go to Athens today and go to the Museum of the Acropolis, and I know it's been changed, but I assume it's still to some degree the same, you can see some relics from the first temple, the temple that the Persians destroyed, which is on the Acropolis, where the Parthenon now stands. But I forget who said it originally, but it's really true. After this war, East and West would no longer be merely directions. You can talk about the East and you can talk about the West. Neither of them are unified, neither of them are homogenized, but there's an Eastern understanding of what it is to be a people, and there's a Western understanding, and they aren't the same. Thermopylae was a loss, but in the great sea battle of Salamis, the Greeks won. Now, they had previously turned back a smaller incursion, but this was the big one. This is the one that really, really mattered. So that's 480. 10 years later, Socrates is born. It's impossible to overstate the importance of Socrates in the philosophic development of the West. And when we get into hopefully next week, we'll see how I can do. When we get a little further along, you will realize that when we talk about religion, what was the religion of the West, the religion of the people, our ancestors who became Christians? A lot of their religion was philosophy. You'll see the overlaps when we talk about Stoicism particularly. Xerxes is actually murdered. Another extraordinary important thing happens during this period, and that is the Oresteia by Aeschylus, the development of Athenian drama. If you want to understand the mind of the ancient Greeks, there's very few places better to go than the Greek theater, and particularly the dramas. They will repay any number of rereadings. And unfortunately, the only completely surviving trilogy we have is Aeschylus's Oresteia. And it's extraordinary. The Oresteia is really an extended story about how the Greeks became no longer, well, I should say the Athenians, became no longer a people of ancient blood feuds, but a people of law. And there's a lot more. To the Greeks, theater was not merely entertainment. It should be entertainment, but it was not merely entertainment. And particularly the tragedies. The Greek tragedies were, to attend these plays was a civic ritual. They weren't performed often, but they were memorized. People knew them. The reason we have the large number of plays that we have is that long after they had ceased to be performed very often, they were preserved for reading, and they were taught for the quality of the language and also for the quality of the thought in them. After the conclusion of the Greco-Persian Wars, the Athenians formed what they called the Delian League, named after the island of Delos. This was supposed to be a defensive league, all right, and of the cities, of the Greek cities. Not all the cities joined, but many did, and particularly the islands joined. And so the Athenians said, well, you know, fellows, it really doesn't make a lot of sense for you to build ships and, you know, build ships and man ships and pay for them to be as part of your country's league. Just give us the money and we'll take care of it. You don't need any fleets. You don't need any army. Within a period of maybe a dozen years, the Delian League was the Athenian Empire. And the Athenians were rather heavy taskmasters. They also weren't too particular about where they spent the money that they were still raising from the Delian League. And a lot of it went to build the Parthenon. Right? Yeah. There was a great resistance to this from some of the other city-states, and in 431 there began the Peloponnesian War. This is going to end the classical period, really, the beginning of the end. If you haven't read Thucydides, you've really missed something. But the Peloponnesian War was fought between, on the one side, the Athenians and their clients, allies, and subjects, and on the other side, the Spartans and their allies. It was a war that was fought on 3 continents. It was a war that killed large numbers of Greek men. It was a war that pretty much spelled the end of the old style of classical Greek political arrangements, in which every city-state was independent of all the others. This was different. This was changing the world. And it really did change the world. It also caused extraordinarily heavy losses on both sides, so that both the Greek city-states as a whole were greatly weakened by the war, simply because so many people killed, so much economic activity was disrupted, and all the rest. The end of the Peloponnesian War ended with Athens' unconditional surrender to the Spartans, and the end of their supremacy at sea. 399, death of Socrates. Remember when I told you births? All that happened in one man's lifetime. It was not a boring world. It was rough. It wasn't boring. And 2 years later, Plato is born. 2 years later, Plato is born. No, I'm wrong. Sorry. Plato was born a couple of years before Socrates, actually. That's interesting. Aristotle was born in 384. Why is Aristotle important? Because he's such a significant philosopher, and he had so much to do with sort of shaping the mind of the West. And just to talk about the end of the classical world, the real end of the classical world comes with Alexander the Great. Aristotle was Alexander the Great's tutor. So here we are. These things click together. Alexander, following the death assassination, under very mysterious circumstances, of his father, Philip II, who was the one of the great, great kings of that part of the world. Alexander follows his father's dream, which is to defeat the Persians, to go to war against the Persians on their own ground. Alexander has a very superior war machine. He is very young. He's in his teens. And yet, he defeats Darius III of Persia, and by 331, it's all over. Darius is gone, the Persian Empire is gone. And you've got a completely new world, because the Persian Empire was immensely wealthy. And here's a great story. In addition to Aristotle as his tutor, Alexander had a Spartan veteran who was his tutor in military things. He was sort of his trainer and tutor. And one day, when Alexander was putting incense on the fire for the sacrifice, he reached into the thing of incense and threw it on. And the Spartan rapped him across the hand. And he said, "That's too much. That's wasteful. 2 fingers is enough." After Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, he sent this tutor a present, an entire shipload of incense and a message: "Today I offer with both hands." Now you've got this immensely wealthy empire that is dominated by Macedonians and Greeks. Macedonians are sort of Greek. They think they're Greek. Some of the Greeks don't think they're Greek, but they really want to be Greek. And so there they are. Greek culture had already penetrated the Persian Empire to a great degree. Now you've got Greek authority, Persian Greek authority. And Alexander is and should be an extremely controversial figure. And my personal opinion, he was kind of nuts, really. And Alexander pushed and pushed and pushed. His army revolted against him a couple of times. He pushed and pushed and pushed. He didn't want to stop conquering. Mm-hmm. After he conquered he wanted to keep going. And he did. He crossed the Indus River. He won his last great battle in India. Then his army really revolted for sure. And in an act of real spite, he did not lead them back the way they had come. He led them back to a desert that resulted in a very large number of them dying. And they went back to Babylon. And while they were in Babylon, Alexander died. Was he poisoned? Or did he die of cirrhosis of the liver, which is quite likely, given how much he drank? What happened? All we know is that he died. And we know this, too. Alexander had an infant son who was his supposed heir, but he was an infant. He had very ambitious generals. On his deathbed, he's purported to have been asked to whom, it was obvious he was dying, apparently, who should rule the empire? And he replied, the strongest. This was an invitation to go to war against each other, which they took up with great delight and immediately. You know, I'm sure you've all heard the saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Well, the two of these guys knew how to use his armies, and they were really good at it. So they sat down and they split up the empire. Various people went to various places. This is now 323 BC. And these are the empires that will figure very heavily in Rome's history when she gets there. The most successful of them in the long term, of course, was that of the the Macedonian general Ptolemy. Ptolemy took over Egypt. Egypt becomes extremely culturally important. Well, that's a lie. No, it doesn't. It's always been culturally important. Alexandria becomes extremely culturally important. Alexandria was a city that had been founded, like a large number of others of the same name, by Alexander the Great. And it was not an Egyptian city. It was a Greek city. People are shocked to learn this, but the Ptolemies were absolutely 100% Greek, as long as you're willing to call the Macedonians Greek, and that goes through the entire line. They were the last of the Macedonian, what are known as successor kingdoms, meaning successors to Alexander the Great. They were the last one to go. And the last pharaoh was Cleopatra VII. Yeah, that Cleopatra. So they had a good long run, they did, the Ptolemies. But the Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria. And although they adopted many of the trappings of the ancient Egyptians and let the Egyptian religion flourish and all the rest of it, they were as Greek can be. It was illegal for a person of Egyptian birth to live inside Alexandria. It was a non-Egyptian city. So much so that in Latin, the word, as I said, there were many cities named Alexandria, so they all had some sort of addition to their name, so you could tell which one we're talking about. It was known as Alexandria ad Aegyptus. Alexandria at Egypt, not in, at. So, and why am I pushing so much about Alexandria? Because St. Mark is associated with Alexandria later. All right? Believe me, there are reasons for these things. Aristotle dies in 322, so he outlived Alexandria. No, that's not important. What's happening with the Romans at this time? Rome had expanded from what it seems to have been mostly a small agricultural village in a not particularly salubrious part of part of Italy. You all know, I assume you all know some of the founder myths. If you don't, I'll be talking about them later, that help sort of define the Romans to the Romans. But they had eventually extended, to a large degree, their hegemony over Italy, at least up almost as far as we think of what Italy is today. But they were in constant conflict with the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians were a Semitic people. They were the Phoenicians. Carthage was a Phoenician colony. And the Phoenicians were, as I say, they were a Semitic people. They were primarily a trading people. They were very competent. And when necessary, they could be very good at warfare, as they proved many times. They didn't like to fight much. So they hired people to do their fighting for them. They produced the generals. This is really true. There were a relatively small number of people who fought for Carthage were actually Carthaginian by birth. Most of them were mercenaries, but the leadership was always Carthaginian. And the Carthaginians really, knew what they were doing about motivation. If you were a Carthaginian general and lost too important a battle, you're probably going to get killed. Crucified, literally. Literally. By the way, is that coin still pushing around?
Right there.
Thank you. Anyhow, there were a series of wars, the three Punic Wars. Now, we're up to 200 years before the birth of Christ now. And in the three Punic Wars, the first one was long and bloody, and Rome won. The last person to surrender was a general named Hasdrubal, who held out on Mount Eryx in Sicily for a very, very long time. Finally did did surrender. And the Rome felt like, okay, we've taken care of that little problem. We'll get back to that. For those of you who are Orientalists, because I don't know much, 206 BC, the Han dynasty is established in China. China makes a change at this point. Up to this point, they have been very hostile to the idea that anybody outside of China could have anything that would be of value of them. But under the Han dynasty, they begin to encourage trade with the West. And this isn't necessarily a big factor in the world in which Mark is going to be living, except for the fact that the establishment of the Silk Road and all the rest of it, that means that don't think that the people who lived around the Mediterranean had a limited worldview. They knew that there was a lot more world than they lived in. They might not know a hell of a lot about it, but they knew it. And they certainly were aware of some of the traditions of India and China. And there was a very heavy trade, mostly silver going east and silk coming west during the period of Mark's life. Oops, how did I miss that? Okay. Yeah. One of the successor kingdoms was founded by a general named Seleucus. It was one of the more successful ones, known as the Seleucid Empire. And the Seleucids ruled from Syria. They had managed to establish their dominance pretty far down towards Ptolemy's empire in Egypt. And they had what they held included all of what is today Israel. Along came a king, a Seleucid king, who decided that he'd had enough of these people not doing what he wanted them to do in terms of recognizing that they should offer sacrifice to him and his gods. The Jews didn't take too kindly to that. And under a family called the Maccabees, they revolted against the Seleucids. There are two books in the Apocrypha, First and Second Maccabees, which are essentially a military history of the war, of the revolt. And it's fascinating. This becomes a big point in Judaism. That is the success of the Maccabean revolt and the reestablishment of temple worship after the temple had been conquered and desecrated. This is what Hanukkah celebrates, the reconsecration of the temple with a miraculous provision of oil. So the Maccabean revolt's pretty successful, and you've got Israel has thrown off the Seleucids now, so they're going to be more or less independent for a while. The Second Punic War, how did I skip that? The Second Punic War, I can't believe I skipped that. Well, it was stupid. Which had been fought 218. That's Hannibal. And that ends with, again, a total defeat for the Carthaginians and the reduction of Carthage to not much more than just their own city. So as an empire, they're finished. Okay. This was followed by the Third Punic War after the Maccabean Revolt, which ended with complete destruction of Carthage. They just totaled it. They trashed it completely. Carthage ceased to exist and would not exist until refounded by the Romans as a Roman city. So that's the end of that. This allowed Rome to expand into all of what is now Tunisia and Libya. So they're controlling most of the Mediterranean by this point. It was immediately followed by conquest of Greece, because some of the Greeks had decided to back the Carthaginians. Bad move, and there's that. Now there comes a period that is so complex, I'm not going to go into it at any great length. I know you think I've bored you already. But what is happening in Rome, and this becomes very important, what is happening in Rome is that the old Roman Republican system, the system that had endured with, with significant changes ever since they kicked the kings out, is falling apart. And it's falling apart because it was founded, it's really hard to explain. It's falling apart, I believe, because ambition replaced virtue, to put it as simply as possible. All of the old Roman myths have to do with the Roman virtue in honoring the gods properly and in putting the good of the whole people, the whole city, above all else. And that ceased to be. All that sort of idealism had just died. And I think it dies really with it's completely dead by the assassination of the brothers Gracchus, who were radical land reformers and radical politicians. They were what were known as tribunes, and it was considered the highest degree of bad things, the highest degree of actual, what's what I'm looking for? It was worse than, it was treachery against the gods to even touch with violence a tribune of the plebs. The Gracchi were both assassinated, and they had another tribune killed themselves. So, these are not nice people. And the empire falls into what is effectively civil war. The two great figures here are Marius and Sulla. When Rome's so many problems became obvious, there was a movement of Germanic peoples from the north. And there was a great battle fought in 105 near Orange. The Orange over there, not the one over here. It's almost nobody knows about it. Well, I mean, obviously it's known, but people don't write books about it. People don't write novels about it. People don't talk about it. The Battle of Araucio. It was probably the worst defeat ever suffered by the Roman army. It was bigger than Cannae. And two entire Roman armies were wiped out. And the Celts just kept coming, the Celts and the Gauls. Rome was petrified, terrified. And they elected as consul Marius. Gaius Marius was a man of very low birth, but very high military skill. They elected him consul, and in 102, at the Battle of Aquasextii, they beat a combined army of Teutons and Abrones and killed probably 90,000 people. 90,000! And, no machine guns, no napalm, no A-bombs, just pointy things with metal, It's almost unbelievable, but it happened. And it wasn't the end. Another tribe, the Cimbri, came over again the next year, and Marius was again elected consul. This was the first time anybody had been elected 2 times in a row. That was another breaking of the Constitution. And he goes off into the Battle of Vercellae, which is actually in Italy. They'd gotten that far. At the Battle of Vercellae, again, a massively bloody battle. About 100,000 Cimbri were killed, including their king, who had been the guy who started the whole mess with the Battle of Araucio. Marius is elected for a 3rd time. Marius is now effectively a dictator. In 73, well, I should go a little bit more about that. There's this period with Marius and Sulla. Sulla was originally one of his lieutenants, but he became his rival. Marius and Sulla are the great contenders for who is going to be the real top dog in Rome. You want to read a great novel about this? First Man in Rome. It's excellent. To show you how far things have fallen, both Marius and Sulla not only massacred prisoners, But when they took the city, and it changed hands a few times, they instituted proscriptions. Now, some of you may remember that scene in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where the triumvirate is sitting there with a list of names and they're ticking the names. Yeah. This is what they did. They would write a list of names and say, these people are my enemies. They're enemies of the state. They're enemies of Rome. Whoever kills them gets most of their property, but I'll take some, and we'll just post this all over the city. That's what a proscription is. Both sides did it. There were senators who had their heads chopped off in public. This was a complete breakdown of social order, replaced by pure military power for whoever was in charge. Marius predeceases Sulla, and Sulla actually lives out his life. But the old system is gone. The old system is dead. And it's terribly depressing to the old, anybody who had a real belief in the old Rome, the sort of Rome that our founders here in America idealized. This was not old Rome. This was Chicago. In 73 to 71, there was something else that had absolutely shocked Roman society and the whole empire. That's what is known as the Third Servile War. A servile war is a war against slaves. They had been two previously, but they were both way down south in Sicily. The Third Servile War is Spartacus, who defeated a couple of Roman armies before he was finally beaten, and 7,000 slaves were crucified. That rocked Rome to the foundations. 70 BC, let's get off with killing people. Birth of Publius Virgilius Maro, Virgil. Virgil is going to redefine the Roman myth to a large extent. He's going to become the great, I'll talk more about him under culture. He's going to become one of the two greatest poets of his day, Roman poets. He's going to have an immense influence, both politically and culturally. And so Virgil is somebody worth remembering. 63 BC, another outbreak of trouble in what is now Israel, and Pompey, Pompey, takes the city of Jerusalem and takes the temple by siege. He's got it. Okay. Pompey horrifies the people of Israel because he goes into the Holy of Holies, the place where only the high priest is supposed to go, and only once a year, which has always made me wonder who kept it clean. But no, really, I mean, I wonder. But Pompey goes in and is astonished to find there's nothing there. That's where you go to meet God, but there's no statue. There's nothing there. It astounded him. By the way, just some of you already know this. It's just one of those little trivia things that I find fascinating. I'm sure you've always noted how when the altar girl sets up the altar for Mass, the chalice and the paten are underneath a veil. Yeah. Okay. Do you know why? Why it's that shape?
No.
Represents a tent.
I'm sorry, Chris.
And a tent. And the tent that it represents was the tent of meeting. That was the tent that Moses had in the wilderness where he would go to talk with God privately. And the dimensions of the tent of meeting were what were used for the dimensions of the Holy of Holies. There's depths and depths and depths in this stuff. Okay, so anyhow, the whole system's broken down. You've now got a couple of triumvirates ruled by three different men, but that's not going to work. All these guys want to be the guy. And finally, Caesar manages to finish off his competitors and becomes dictator for life, which wasn't long because he's murdered by Marcus Brutus and a lot of other people. And that's effectively, everybody knows now that's the end. That is the end. It's over. Caesar's murderers and one of his followers, Mark Antony, and his adoptive son and nephew, Octavian, set up another triumvirate and then immediately go to war with each other. This is finally brought to an end in 30 BC. So now we're up to like 30 years before Jesus was born. At the Battle of Actium, which was a great sea battle off the west coast of Greece, where Octavian's fleet, not Octavian, Octavian's fleet pretty much destroys all possibility of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. They're finished. That's it. They're done. It's only a matter of time, and it won't be long. And so that's it. And Octavian is now the undisputed ruler of Rome. Augustus is smart. Augustus maintains the outward form of the old republic and refuses to be called emperor, refuses to be called king. He allows himself to be called princeps, which simply means the first. But he's really running the thing. Everybody knows he is really, really running the show. No, we don't need that. We don't need that either. 18 BC. 18 BC. Massive building projects undertaken by King Herod. Herod gets nothing but a bad name in Scripture and probably deserves it. But there are a couple of good things to be said about him. He was a very shrewd politician. He was very well connected. He had spent time as a hostage in Rome and knew a lot of the major players in Rome. He was a client king, but he was very, very, very wealthy. And he used most of his money to build stuff. And one of the things he built was the temple. This is the temple that Jesus knew. It was much bigger than Solomon's temple. It was much grander. It was a huge complex. It was one of the biggest buildings in the world.
Are we up to 4 now?
Pardon?
Four of them now? Or if I've lost track, how many we built?
How many temples?
3. How many temples?
Okay, just 3.
Well,
This is the third one.
He expanded on the third one. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
In any event, this is the temple that Jesus knew. So it's being built. So recognize that by the time Jesus was born, the temple wasn't all that old. The idea of the temple was old. The temple worship was old. The site had been revered for over 1,000 years, but the actual building that he knew was one of these sort of wonder of the world things. I lost something here. Doesn't matter. Okay. Jesus is born sometime between 6 and 4 BC. All right. Augustus is still on the throne. Augustus had a nice long run, but he's still on the throne. 9 AD, so Jesus Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which many of you are familiar with. This is where 2 Roman legions are completely wiped out by the Germans in the forest of the Teutoburg Wald. At that point, the Roman Empire takes a pause. We're not going to push out anymore. We need to regroup here. This really shook their confidence, and particularly shook Augustus's confidence. He was very, very, very distressed about that. He lived another 5 years. He died in 14, and his adopted son, Tiberius, comes to the throne. Tiberius is emperor when Jesus is crucified. Okay. Tiberius dies. He's followed by Caligula. Yeah. Oh, no, we all know about Caligula. During this period, Mark's growing up. And we'll talk later about Mark as he's shown in Scripture. Mark is growing up. Mark's a teenager or a young man. The year 49 AD, and this is problematic, okay? It's very problematic, but this is the traditional date given, and it's the date that the Coptic Church believes very strongly was the date that St. Mark founded the church in Alexandria. All right. Somewhere between 160 and 130, Papias is born. You never heard of Papias. Don't pretend you have. All right? He's not a saint. But I think he's an extraordinarily important figure. And I'm going to talk a good bit about him. And then
Can you
we'll
spell
finish
his
up.
name?
Papias.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to read you a couple of things about Papias. Papias was one of the apostolic fathers. He was a bishop. He was a bishop of Hierapolis, which is modern Pamukkale, Turkey. Anybody been there? Except Gwen and I? All right, I'll tell you about it later because it's important.
Lots of pillars.
He lived around 60 to around 130 AD. He wrote a book, The Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord, probably around 95 to 110 AD. This work has been lost, but it is preserved in part in the work of later writers, including Irenaeus of Lyon and Eusebius of Caesarea. It is a very important early source on the Christian oral tradition, and especially on the origins of the Gospels. We don't know a lot about Papias, except what he says, what little can be, sort of inferred or gleaned from his own writing. But Polycarp's disciple Irenaeus, writing about 180, Bishop Polycarp was one of the early martyrs and a great saint, described him as an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp. The John reference here is the disciple John. It's the disciple and evangelist John. Now, one of the things I'm going to be talking about that is very helpful to know. The Gospels are inspired, but they are written by human beings. I mean, which means they write them in a given language, and they write them using some of the conventions of that language. That's worth remembering when we get to the Gospel. So I'll be talking later more about literary conventions, but I want to tell you about one right now. It's a literary convention that had been introduced by Herodotus and later picked up by Thucydides, that if you're going to be writing history, you tell people where you got your information from. Where did you get this? You don't just, so say, this happened. You say, well, here's my source. References to Harvard will be omitted at this point. This is what Papias says in his introduction. I shall not hesitate also to put into ordered form for you, along with the interpretations, everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders and noted down carefully, for the truth of which I vouch. For unlike most people, I took no pleasure in those who told many different stories, but only in those who taught the truth. Nor did I take pleasure in those who reported their memory of someone else's commandments, but only in those who reported their memory of the commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders arrived, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples. For I did not think that information from the books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. In other words, I didn't see Jesus, but I saw people who saw Jesus. And they were important people, and I talked to them. So Papias was, while he was Bishop of Hierapolis, which was a major city, he was inquiring of anybody he met there what the surviving disciples of Jesus and the elders, that is, the surviving apostles, were saying.
Father, where would that passage from Papias, where would one find that?
It's not from Papias. It's in, it's in his preface. I think it's in Irenaeus, but it might be in Polycarp. I should have written that down, and I didn't. One of the disciples whom he knew was Aristion. Aristion was possibly Bishop of Smyrna. And another, whom he refers to as John the Elder, was John the Evangelist, who was Bishop of Ephesus. Now, John was the last of the disciples to die, and he lived to a very great age. Papias heard John the Evangelist preach, or so he said. Papias also frequently cites material from the daughters of Philip. Philip the apostle. Philip settled in Hierapolis. I'm going to say something about Hierapolis and the daughters of Philip in a moment, but here's the final citation. The final thing I want to read you about Papias. The elder used to say, this is John the Elder, St. John, Mark, in his capacity as Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately as many things as he recalled from memory, though not in an ordered form, of the things either said or done by the Lord. For he, that is Papias, neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him, but later, as I said, that's Mark he's referring to, neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But later, as I said, Peter, who used to give his teachings in the form of kriai, but had no intention of providing an ordered arrangement of the logia, the words of the Lord. Consequently, Mark did nothing wrong when he wrote down some individual items just as he related them from memory, for he made it his one concern not to omit anything he had heard or to falsify anything. Now that Greek word karai, it's a literary form. Again, you got to understand, these are people of a certain time and place. They're going to use the literary forms they have. It's similar to an epigram, except it is usually in this form. A asked B, and B said this. All right? Or A challenged B, and B said this. And then they're usually fairly short. Some aren't, but they're usually fairly short. And then there's a saying. But it's not just the same as an epigram, because it's always attributed to a prominent person. Any of that sound familiar to you? How often in the scriptures does somebody challenge Jesus or ask and Jesus replies? That's the form. That's the form. Okay, now, one more thing and then I'll stop and you can either go home or talk. About the reference that I had to Papias being much in, frequently citing the daughters of Philip. All right? I'm just going to read you more or less. In 2011, the Italian archaeologist Francesco D'Andrea claimed to have discovered the original tomb of Philip during excavations in ancient Hierapolis, which is very close to Pamukkale. The first-century tomb, found to be empty of relics, stood at the center of the 4th and 5th century three-nave basilica, the Church of the Sepulchre, which was one of the focal points of an entire ancient pilgrimage hill complex dedicated to Philip. This is where we went, Glenn, you remember? Ancient Greek prayers are carved into the walls of the tomb and church venerating Philip the Apostle. And a 6th century bread stamp shows Philip holding bread with this specific 3-nave church on his left side, and the previously identified Martyrion church. That's a church that's built over the site of a martyrdom. Martyrion church on its right, removing all doubts about the basilica being the one to contain the original tomb of the apostle. The church built on his tomb and the Martyrion church some 40 yards away were places of such intense veneration for centuries that in the Philip's Church of the Sepulchre, the marble floors were worn down by the feet of thousands of people. So this, I think that Papias is a pretty darn good source. And the really kind of the heart and soul of what we think we know about Mark, other than what's in Scripture, comes out of Papias. His role as St. Peter's interpreter in Rome. And so here we've got St. Mark, who was, as far as we know, we'll talk about who he was later, as far as we know, born in what is now Israel, raised in a Jewish community there, but obviously well educated, speaks not only Greek but also Latin, goes to Rome with St. Peter, where he's in and amongst the very heart of the Roman world, goes to Alexandria, perhaps, maybe, probably, where he's in one of the last of the great Greek cities. He's living in 3 worlds. He moves in 3 worlds. He works in 3 worlds. I'll probably talk later about the fact that Mark's gospel clearly was originally written in Greek. But according to some of the early writers, he himself did the Latin translation when he moved to Aquileia. So that's the basis for all this. The idea that if we're going to read Mark's gospel together, it helps us know what kind of world Mark was living in. And we don't know nearly as much as we'd like to know about Mark. It's not possible to deal with him the way we can deal with Peter or Paul, to try to say what kind of handle can we get on what kind of person he was. We can't really do that. We just don't have enough data. It's as simple as that. But what we can say is we know what he was trying to do, and we know that he was trying to do it for Greeks, for Jews, for Romans. And the more we can know about each of those people, I think the more he'll be able to do for us. So, I had said I would try to keep all of these sessions to under 90 minutes, and this was 65. So, I don't mean keep the session, I mean keep my part of it. So, 2 quick things about sources. If you're going to follow along, if you're going to bring a Bible, please, either the King James or the Revised Standard Version. Not the New Revised Standard Version, which is nasty. This is what you want. If you can find a copy of this, if you can find a copy, buy it. This is the new Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha. And it's a study Bible. It's got lots of notes. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. And it's the Revised Standard Version, which after the King James, I think, is the most faithful version. And it's actually good language. It reads well there. Secondly, if any of you get really interested in some of the stuff about the very early Christian church, Papias and earlier, there is a wonderful website called Early Christian Writings. Some of them are presented in the original Greek or Aramaic, but all of them are translated if they are. Otherwise, they're in English. It really should be called Earliest Christian Writings because most of it is 1st, 2nd century. This is super early stuff, and so much of what we think we know comes from later. And I personally have a very, very high opinion of the validity of the oral tradition. But I know a lot of modern Americans don't, probably think if it didn't get written down, it didn't happen. Well, early Christian writings is a very good source if you want to see what was being written and read. So, any comments, questions?
There was a
Ma'am.
coin?
Pardon?
Explain the coin.
Oh, right. I had a reason to the coin. Yeah. How many of you were in church last Sunday? Father John, raise your hand. You remember in the gospel, it was about the man who agreed with about the householder who went out, the vineyard owner who went out
Yes.
and hired people.
For a penny.
And he agreed with those who he hired first for a penny a day. Well, that was a penny. That's a denarius.
Silver.
When denarius is a silver coin. This one's badly tarnished, unfortunately. It was the basic silver coin for the Romans for centuries. You remember, some of you, a few of you, most of you, are old enough to remember British coinage pre-digitization. Pounds, shillings, pence. L, pounds. Libra, pound in
Latin.
Latin. S, shilling, but not for shilling, for sestertius, which is a Latin coin, and D for denarius, penny. This happens to be a denarius of the Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian was emperor from 69 to 79 AD. He's my favorite emperor. He was alive when Jesus was alive. You have now touched something that was in the world while St. Mark was alive. Now, if you're like me, that kind of gives you a bit of a chill. And if you're not, you should be. The idea that the ancient world is dead is never completely true. It lives on in ways of which most of us are unaware. But occasionally the fabric is lifted and something happens, or you see something, or you touch something that makes you realize these were my people, and still are. The Jews, they're our people. They really are. There couldn't be Christians without Judaism. The Greeks and Romans, they're our people too. The world as it is would not be as it is without them. So I hope that you'll stick with me for another week or maybe two of background stuff like this. And then we'll take the tools that we've tried to accumulate and start digging into the gospel. Any other, sir?
Just one quick comment. This is just something that came across my brain a couple of days ago. The Roman Catholic Church is a continuation of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
The Holy Roman.
I think somebody said the Roman Empire is dead and the Catholic Church is its ghost.
Yeah.
I can't remember who said that. It's an actual quote. I didn't. No, and even to the effect that the term Pontifex Maximus, the Pontifex Maximus was a very, very ancient part of the Roman Constitution. When the Romans tossed out their king, they had a problem in that the king had certain religious roles that only he could fulfill, as well as administrative and military roles. Well, the administrative and military roles are going to be shared between the two consuls elected annually. What about the religious roles? That had to be lifetime. So they said, well, we'll just create our Pontifex Maximus. And he was the head of all Roman religion. All right? So the Pontifex Maximus had been a title of the king. It's now an office under the Republic. It's an office that Julius Caesar held. It's an office that the subsequent emperors held. And now it's one of the titles of the Pope. So his direct line of descent in terms of that title, Pontifex Maximus, between the Roman emperors and the Bishop of Rome. Absolutely correct for it.
Was the Herod that built the temple also the one of the slaughtered the innocents? There were
Yes,
so many Herods.
Herod the Great. That's what he's known as, Herod the Great. Sir.
Clarification question. You said if we're going to read only from these two,
Well,
not from. And I just want to do what the teacher says. Well, I only want to know why don't look at the other one. It has been asked to guys, or it goes in.
absolutely. The language is horrible.
Correct. Thanks. That's all I need.
It's just awful.
Right.
And they twisted it all out of shape so as to avoid using male pronouns for God. And, you know.
Neither no more men and women in the world?
Apparently not. They did all kinds of things. It was terrible because this was the finest translations of the King James. And the reason I talk about the Oxford Annotated is the annotations are so useful. It's really very solid. It's not a controversial Bible. It's not a Bible that was presented to push Anglicanism or Protestantism or Catholicism or wokeism or any other ism. It's just really as a genuine attempt to make Scripture accessible to those of us who don't have the depth of learning or the language skills that the translators did. I'm very, very high on it. What do we own, Glenn? 3, 4 copies? I don't know.
I don't know.
I figure I'll wear them out sooner or later.
I have a question about the tent of meeting.
Yes.
Is that the tent that housed the Ark of the Covenant?
Yes.
So that's the tent that David was talking about when he was saying, I'm living in this fine palace of cedar, and the Ark of the Covenant is still stuck out there under a
Good
tent.
job, George. Yep. Yep. The covenant. What? Yeah, that's it. Got it. It's the same thing. And in
So
I think it's in
now,
Leviticus. It gives it's either Exodus or Leviticus. It gives the dimensions of the tent, and that's what Solomon used for the dimensions of the Holy of Holies.
and so we have a symbol of that tent,
Exactly.
except it's not covering the Ark of the Covenant. It's covering a new covenant.
You got it. That's exactly correct. That's the symbolism of it. I talked a couple of years ago at some length to some people here tonight about the symbolism of some of the symbolism of the Mass. And look, the Mass is a work of art. It was given to us by Christ, but it's been fiddled with, added to, taken away from, and so forth, both ceremonially and in words, for centuries. It's a work of art as well as a sacramental truth. And the vestments that we wear, they all mean something. The objects that we use, some of the hand gestures that we make. And there's an incredible number of layers of subtlety in all of these things that the modern world, modern Christianity has been stripped of almost everything that makes it powerful. And it's been reduced down to the point that most Americans think, Christian means be a nice person. And they're sort of morally equivalent. Doesn't mean necessarily believe anything, doesn't mean necessarily have any kind of relationship with God. It's just sort of think you're a nice person and be nice. Because it's nicer to be nice than not to be nice. I mean, that's about the depth of it. And that's not enough.
It's
That
not
is
even
not
right.
enough to fight the evil in the world. That is not enough to allow us to cope with all the loss that this life hands us. It is not enough to satisfy our need for truth. It's cheap, and it's thin, and it's weak. And so much of it, it's just painful to me that so much of the culture of the church has been lost or ignored. And it's very sad. This is why I'm a great proponent of let's decorate the heck out of the inside of our churches so we got lots of things to point to and say, you know what that means? You know what that means? Well, I'm deeply grateful to you all. We'll see how many of you show up next week. Yes, ma'am.
Where did Papias have contact with Mark? Would it have been in Egypt then at Hierapolis?
Papias didn't have contact with Mark. He learned about Mark from John.
Okay, right.
John, the beloved disciple.
All right.
John the evangelist. But, you know, people talk about Eusebius of Caesarea as the father of church history. I don't think that's true. I think Papias was making a very serious effort to make sure that what he had to say was accurate. And to me, that's one of the first marks of a good historian.
But you said his book is lost. Is that right?
Pardon me?
You said Papias's book is lost.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the entire yes, the book is lost in its entirety. It exists only in lengthy quotations in later authors.
And those quotations are found in Irenaeus.
Irenaeus and Eusebius, and I think maybe, who's the famous French theologian from the very early period? Bishop of, I forget. There may be one other who retains it. By the way, I know I can get obsessively detailed sometimes, but really the details of this for tonight are far less important than the general flavor. I want you to get a sort of cultural sense of what it was like. And we'll try to make that happen in ways other than touching the magic denarius. So I promised I would not go on past 9, so that gives us 9 more minutes if anyone's fool enough to want me to fill them.
I have a question, and that's about the things that are quoted. And there's, of course, the Bibles that have everything Jesus said exactly in red letters. There were years between when any of this happened and people that were listening to it, and when anybody got to write anything down and put in his quotes. That's always.
But could I stick my oar in here?
I'm sorry, can you speak up a bit?
Certainly, sir.
Thank you. You and me, right?
Right. In those days, when most people didn't read and write, they had cultivated their memories. Nowadays, we have the crutch of being able to read and write and look it up. And so we lean on that crutch. We put a lot more into our heads than they did in those days.
Except for the Jews. The Jews had an amazing amount of literacy.
Oh, literacy. Oh, yes. Yeah. And so when they speak of Peter,
could read and write.
When they speak of Peter as an illiterate fisherman, I don't think so.
No.
He was
absolutely correct.
He was a Jewish man. He had to be able to stand up in the synagogue, which incidentally was invented during the Babylonian captivity, when they were trying to figure out how to keep
and is a Greek
going.
Word. Yeah. Synagogue
what
is
does
a
it
Greek
mean?
Word. Learning together.
Okay.
Like pedagogy. Mm-hmm. Teaching children.
Okay. So anyway, I thought that you were going to say that it was during the Babylonian captivity that they invented the synagogue, and that helped hold them together.
But that's what becomes the Pharisees, is the synagogue movement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I did reference it, but you're absolutely correct. That's where it happened.
So I would not fail to to listen carefully to anything that is oral history that is said by someone in a pre-literate community. You know, the Hawaiians, for example, memorized their genealogies going back thousands of years, that who was the father of who and who was and so on. And so we have to realize that just because We don't do that. We haven't cultivated that talent. It was there.
The oral tradition can be very, very strong in societies that want it to be. Another mark of the survival of it in the West and in the ancient Near East. Notice how much of the really early stuff is in verse. That makes it easier to remember.
Yeah.
So even if you don't have a copy of it, you may well know it. They're not, ma'am.
Well, in some cultures, like the Indians, for example, the American Indians had like kind of like the beads, like those.
Yes.
The Incas
they
had
had
that. The Incas
pieces
had
of
that.
cloth where they had different things that represented certain stories or whatever.
Quipus.
Pardon?
I think they were called quipus. I think they were called quipus or
Oh, I
quipus.
don't know.
Knots. They had knots. They just
Yeah.
Yeah, and so and sort of in the way that
It's an aid memoir.
sort of aid to memorizing things and whatnot.
It's also interesting to me, just as long as we're hitting these anthropological things, when where is it now? Tick, tick, tick. Yeah. When Papias talks about who he, I talk to people who talk to people, that sort of thing. There's a rule in anthropology, it's called something like the 3-generation gap. Are you all familiar with this?
Yeah.
I'm only a little bit familiar with it, but the way it's usually understood is you probably know a very considerable amount about your parents. I mean, you know things like where they met, where they went to school, where they were born. You know what foods they liked, you know what colors your mother liked, you know that sort of thing. You know a lot about your parents. Your grandparents, not so much. You know some things, but you don't really know nearly as much as you do about your parents. Your great-grandparents, most Americans are lucky if they know their names. I mean, and that's usually referred to as the 3-generation gap. If you talk to somebody who talked to somebody, well, maybe that's pretty good. But once you get past, I talked to a guy who talked to an eyewitness, you're getting into pretty tall weed territory. And that is, Papias is early. He's there. He's talking to people who knew Jesus intimately. And when he talks about John, I think we can trust what he has to say. He's not relying on oral tradition. And by the way, I skipped over something, but essentially, I'm going to go ahead and bust over the whole bloody 90 minutes. Yes. I've got it here somewhere. Fudge! Sorry, folks, I may not be able to find what I'm looking for. Darn it.
Do you remember the topic so you
Yes,
can remind you next week?
It has to do with what Papias says when he says, I did not think that information from the books would provide me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. Here it is. There is some debate about the intention of Papias' last sentence, for I did not think that information from the books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving source. One side of the debate holds with the long-standing opinion of 20th century scholarship that in Papias' day, written statements were held as of lower value than oral statements. The other side observes that living voice was a topos. A topos, sometimes referred to an epithet, is what's the word in English? It's an established phrase. It's a
Cliche? Not a cliche.
not exactly a
Colloquial?
cliche. A way of saying things that everybody knows what it means. I know it's poorly put. A topos is a phrase that refers to personal instruction or apprenticeship. And what he thinks he's saying here is that Papias, what more modern scholars tend to think, is that what Papias is saying is simply that he has a preference for personal instruction over learning from books alone, that he wants to hear from a living voice. And I think that makes sense. You'll notice I rely heavily on quotations because, believe it or not, I'm not old enough to have known Papias. So the closest I can get to his living voice is what somebody wrote down what he said. That's the best I can do. So thank you all very much. I have promised that I would not go on past 9, so it's over. And,
Question not to be answered. And the question is, when you get to the end of would like your thoughts on 1, 2, 3, which way the church world is heading, because you do as much as you do, you have your own views going forward, and I think an awful lot of people are concerned, worried.